Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Kathy Madison. I'll be your moderator today. Before I turn it over to the team presenting, I just want to do a little bit of an intro to who we are here at Comtech and CIDM. Comtech is our consulting company, and it was the first to be established, and it has been in business for quite some time, originally started by Joanne Hackus and now run by Don Stevens. And in our consulting services, we provide anything that you need to help you make your content better for your end users, whether that's helping you with a content strategy, whether it's helping you do a data implementation, or maybe looking at your processes. We cover all of those aspects. And on everything that we consult, we have very similar training classes that we teach to the public. So that's on the Comtech side, and through our clients, they asked us to form an organization so that they can talk to each other, so that managers of those organizations could have a platform to share the best practices. And that's how CIDM came about. And so that is our organization that runs webinars like this. We put on conferences, but the folks that are actually members, as opposed to people that just benefit from CIDM, they get to have additional networking opportunities, such as a roundtable discussion that we do monthly on a hot topic. They have their own Slack channel that they can communicate with, and they get also discounts to all of the CIDM events. So there's links to both if you have any questions on Comtech or CIDM. And we are the same folks. I wear dual hats. I'm a consultant on the Comtech side, and on the CIDM side, I'm the liaison and work with the various members. So on the CIDM side, we do have a Convex coming up in May. This is our rebranded conference. We love the name that we did for Convex during the pandemic when we were only online. So we're carrying that phrase forward. We're going to have Convex Tempe, Convex Ideas, and then Convex Europe. So we're dropping that really long name that we had, Content Management Strategies / DITA North America or DITA Europe. That doesn't roll off your tongue. Convex rolls off a little bit easier. So we're excited. We just closed the call for speakers, so we should have that agenda up I think we're targeting that first week in January to have that up. And if you believe in Convex and believe in CIDM and know we always put on a good conference and you want to get a discount, go ahead and register by the end of 2021 and you get to take advantage of the member rate of 20% off. And then it will go up again in January, and then for a little bit of a discount until our Valentine's Day special, and then you'll pay full price. And then as you get closer to the event, they'll actually will go up slightly. So that's Convex, and it is coming up. I know that both Barry and Jared are hoping to attend live, at least Heretto and Ettaplan plan to. So you'll get to meet them there as well. Oops, I went a little too fast. We have one webinar scheduled right now. We'll have a lot more scheduled for the next quarter. We're just still working on those. This is rescheduled from something that we had originally had in November, and we needed to reschedule it for January. So those are the upcoming webinars, upcoming trainings for Q1. We are doing data basics. We're doing publishing and 2 classes on minimalism, one in Asia, one in Asian hours, which means that it's during the day in Asia and in the evening for the folks here in North America. And then we have creating an effective taxonomy as well happening. So if you want to stay informed and you're not on our mailing list, we encourage you to go to ComtechServe/subscribe and go ahead and sign up for whether you want our newsletter, whether you want only announcements about events. You get some choices there, or you could say, I want all the good emails that Comtech and CIDM send out. You could also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Okay, so now I get to turn it over to these folks, but before I do that, I want to remind everybody we are recording the session, and we'll get that link out to you. And as with all of our webinars, those links are available on the past webinar page of CIDM. If you have comments or just want to express yourself, we encourage you to use the chat. But if you do have questions for the two, we'd like you to use the question dialog box, and then we'll field those questions after they're done. Jared and Barry think that they'll wrap up, within the hour, but they're available for the whole hour and a half if you've got questions for them to take advantage of their time. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to Barry Basser from HyperSTE/Ediplan and Jared Stickler from Heretto. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Share my screen. Let me know once you have a visual.
We're good.
Yeah, very good. So welcome everybody. I'll give to today's webinar about one voice to elevate your customer experience that we're doing together with Heretto, and it's hosted by CIDM, as we of course all know already. A little bit about me, and then I'll ask Jared to introduce himself. But I've been with Ediplan now for since 2012. Before that, Ediplan took over the company Telepress that I worked for, and so I've basically been with the organization for over 20 years now, and been doing different roles. But currently, I'm on the technology side since a few years. So I lead and head the department that's responsible for HyperSTE, the content quality checker. But in addition, I've been working with customers, different industries, different countries in the world. Actually, I think before the pandemic hit, I did over 1 million miles. And so whenever I see that movie with George Clooney, I think it's up in the air. I see myself, not that I see George Clooney, it's like the George Clooney without the hair and without the good looks, obviously, but a lot of that looks familiar. Anyway, enough about me trying to be funny. Barry.Braster@ediplan.com, and there's my number, and we'll repeat that again in the end in case you need to have any further questions afterwards. Jared.
I don't know. I get the George Clooney thing. I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
My name's Jared Stickler. I'm a customer success manager and the documentation manager at Heretto. So not only do I work with customers on implementations of our system and specifically with structured content, I also use it every day. So I'm in charge of managing all of the documentation set that we have. And so that puts me into the mix. I've had a couple of different roles since coming on with the company. I joined in 2017, so it's been about 5 years since I've been in. Prior to that, I have this very extensive employment background that is pretty much exclusively graduate school. I came straight to technology from academia, and my background has little to nothing to do with structured content. So I've kind of everything I know about structured content I've learned in the last 5 years, and my background has been academic philosophy. So strap in, because it's an effort for me to not talk philosophy in the middle of one of these. So Barry's going to have to keep me reined in.
Right. So yeah, very good. Okay, well then, thanks again for joining us for today's webinar. So one voice to elevate your customer experience. So what does that actually, what does that mean, right? So we have, as a company, within everybody here, you may have, or you probably do have, a great product or service that you're trying to sell, not just locally but globally. What does that mean from a customer experience point of view? Well, if I give you a very simple example, as is, you can buy basically the best television in the world, and then you get to the manual, and then the manual has information that is either not clear or concise, is ambiguous, basically, is maybe poorly translated. That's in essence going to affect your experience with that product, and it's going to make that product actually look bad, even though the product itself was great, but the manual that came with it was not. And it's not just about the manual, it's about the online help, it's about basically any content that you produce as an organization that should accompany your product or your service, either in the form of installation instructions or support information, etc., etc. So So that's really what we're trying to do here today, is to give you a bit of an insight how you can provide your customers with content that is accurate and compliant, because we have to realize that English is the language mainly used for technical communication, for content production. If it's not the source language, then it usually is the language that is used when you translate from other source languages. Like, for instance, if it comes from Chinese, you don't necessarily go from Chinese to German. If you have to translate for the German market, you usually use English as a stepping stone towards the other languages. But if the source is not clear, if the source is not concise, then it could mean that you're misinforming your customers. And of course, if you have writers that are located worldwide, you have maybe a global writing team, not just here in the US, then you're going to have to ensure that everyone uses the same terminology, that everyone writes a little bit the same way, that if you have a style guide in place, that people write according to that style guide. Of course, the use of structure, which Jared can talk to you more about. And that's something that we want to basically be talking to you about today. And I think, Jared, you had you wanted to say something about translations, right?
Yeah. So Barry, as we were talking through this and putting this presentation together, I think that fourth bullet point was the one that stuck out to me as being very, very important, but also the least obvious of these. So I think it's going to be really interesting when we get to that point in the discussion to really go into some detail about how having structured content plus a way to enforce style guide rules and company voice, how that actually does translate to being 40% up to 40% cost reduction for translations and source content. So I'm excited to get into that one in more detail, and I think that one will be really beneficial to people.
Very good, thank you. So these are kind of the pain points that we're trying to solve here today. So there is a style guide, but how do we enforce it? How do we ensure that all of our writers are using that? Or I should say, not just only writers, but content creators, right? Because there's a lot of people these days that are involved in content creation.
And these things aren't out of the box. You don't get a new tool and then out of the box you have this style guide enforcement. This is something that has to takes effort to put into, and to make clear what the style guide is, and then you need a way to actually enforce it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you have the ways to enforce it, what are you enforcing? Is it just the style guide? What about terminology?
Right.
If we're using one word that could have multiple meanings, or if we're using multiple words that could have the same meaning, then as far as clarity is concerned, we have a challenge.
That's right.
And then of course that challenge is then also going to exist in other languages. Looking for ways to improve the quality. Is there how much time are we spending on reviewing, internally? Who is involved in content creation? If it's not just the technical writers, then we have subject matter experts or engineers who usually are very much involved, because that's basically where product information or service information is coming from. And then often in an organization, writers are in charge of then taking that information from subject matter experts and putting that into a format that is understandable for your audience. But that also means that from a quality perspective, the SMEs and the engineers also need to be involved and
right.
So.
Right, and getting the enforcement, if you can get the enforcement around the subject matter experts as they're providing that feedback, it's an extra added time saver too, because then the writing teams don't need to go through and manually make the SMEs comments and suggestions and things adhere to the voice. They already will if they're being entered that way.
Yeah. So it's not just about pain points, also it's about how can we elevate the content that we produce. How can we look at the same time, which is kind of an added benefit, is if we do that, then there are ways that can reduce cost, reduce review time, etc. But that's a little bit more about what the next slide is about.
Right, right. So, I mean, we run into this all the time. You know, a lot of our prospect base and our customer base um, really come to us because they want to make sure that they don't have content that leads to poor customer experiences. Because what customers and prospects for us are starting to realize is that the content that you're producing is as much a part of the product as the actual product that you have, because it contributes, the content you have contributes to the overall experience of the product. If I have a product, like you said, let's say I buy a new TV and it comes in, and the TV might be a fantastic product, but if I have to set it up and I'm going to do that setup myself and I can't find that content, or the content's incorrect or something along those lines, it contributes to my overall experience with the product, and not purely just with the experience of the content itself, but the actual product experience can be poor if the content's not good. And so there are ways we can, you know, by enforcing some of these rules and guidelines around the voice and trying to elevate that voice, we can start to minimize and mitigate human errors and risks by reducing ambiguous content or vague content. Yeah, and then the translation costs that come into this, you know, certainly for a lot of companies, translation is a part of what they're doing. Not only can very clean and concise content reduce translation costs and times, structured content does that too. And we can get into some of the details about why specifically structured content can reduce translation costs. But I think when you add up the enforcement that can be provided from you know, style guide and terminology, when you can enforce certain sets of terminology that your company has agreed on, couple that with structured content, then you start looking at translation costs really, really going down, because you're not sending out something like a Word document for translation that you can't break up into smaller component parts.
Yeah, and don't forget that if you have your source well structured, well defined as far as you know, reducing the ambiguity of it, then again, going back to the television, you know, if I have questions because the manual wasn't clear enough how I do need to do certain things, then I'm not going to call the manufacturer and their support desk and ask them the questions that I didn't get answered in the first. And so think about what you're preventing as far as costs.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's a great point. Having good content, having consistent, clear content that does solve the problems that your customers may bump into will reduce your support load for those customers, which is that's a really important point. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the last point I wanted to make was as far as, because, you know, kind of depends on who we have here today, who will be watching this webinar. But if you are, for instance, in aerospace or in the defense industry, then there are medical too, regulatory contractual requirements. So if you have, for instance, Asian companies exporting their products to the US or Europe, it could be that according to European directives, for instance, or ANSI requirements here in the US, that there are going to be some requirements for not just your product, but also your documentation. And that's something you have to meet as well. So if you want to globalize your product, it can sometimes mean that the countries to which you export your product, it could mean that you're being asked to update your content according to those local regulations as well. And by having it structured, by having the ambiguity removed, you will basically automatically meet those local requirements.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's a really important point. I mean, I know that a lot of the people who are moving towards this type of, I mean, this is really, we're talking about content operations. This isn't just technical docs. This isn't just some marketing. This is all of an organization's content operations. If you can have these systems in place that will check the content to make sure you're meeting regulatory and contractual requirements, and you have an automated system in place that can check that, then you really are reducing the time and the effort, and therefore the cost for maintaining and creating new which is really important.
Yeah, very good. So making your content accurate, compliant, efficient is something that you can accomplish here. We just to kind of summarize, because there's a lot of bullet points here, as you can see, about actually having the bullet points, but risks are being reduced. You're delivering error-free content in not just English, but basically in all languages, because if the source is clear and concise, you'll see those benefits actually slip through in translations as well. That can reduce claims. You're going to be able to do the right content at the right time to the right audience, comply with industry standards and style guides, validate industry credibility, because if you do comply with certain aspects that are being, whether it's the Microsoft Manual of Style or whether it's S1000D if you're in defense, it's going to allow you to validate industry credibility, and therefore it can help actually open up new markets as well. Reducing your translation cost also has to do with reducing your word count. It's actually something to pause with, because when we do a controlled language implementation or content quality implementation, simplified English, whatever you want to use it, part of that actually is training. So we released an e-learning package over the summer. We're the first company to do so, and content creators, technical writers, subject matter experts can go through that course. And the course is not just looking at the writing rules that you need to have in place in order to create that clarity, but also how can you distinguish the nice to know versus the need to know? How can you be giving information, content to your customers that is something that they need at that particular time? I mean, there's a lot of beautiful things to say about a product, of course, but is that really necessary for the customer to know at that particular point in time? And if you do it that way, including how to structure things, then it can actually, we've trained now over 3,000, close to 3,500 people worldwide. And the results that we have seen come back from that is that content on average is reduced by 40%, because people, when they write new content, they just stick with the need to know and get rid of the nice to know.
So this is a course that would take people through best practices for creating compliant content for their industries.
Yeah, it's not just about the theory. It comes with exercises that people do. So it's about 3.5 hours, excluding the exercises. So it will take you a few more hours to do the whole thing. But again, the idea is that you look at content, using an article in front of a noun. Why do I need to do that? Well, because if a noun, for instance, if the noun is a word like switch is often used both as a noun as well as a verb. By having an article in front of it, the audience will recognize it as a noun and therefore do the right thing. Because if you say switch, do you mean switch off the switch, or what is it that you're trying to say? Or and again, it may make complete sense for an engineer, but for an end user, it may not make sense. And that's what we're going to tackle here.
Looking at this list here, I think under Elevate customer experience, the improved findability and readability. The findability part of that I think is really interesting, because whether we acknowledge it or not, whenever we're creating documentation, we're creating content for our product lines, whatever those product lines are, we are doing some form of education on how we are. It may not be explicit, it may not be a course, but by using certain terms when we're writing, we are educating our audience, our readers, to think about our products with a particular language set, for example. And by having consistency across all of your content, let's say, I don't know, I'm just thinking about some term. Let's use switch as an example. So if we use the term, if we have as an organization decided we're going to use the term switch when we mean to, change something from one direction or another, let's say, if we've settled on that or if we haven't settled on that and we use switch in some cases, we might use turn in other cases or change in some other cases, then findability is going to be much more difficult, because a user might come to your site and they might actually search for the term turn, or they might search for change, and really the content they need has the word switch in it.
Right.
And so if we can enforce some consistency around our terminology for those important terms, it will improve findability. And if you improve findability, you're going to reduce your support load, and the customer experience will just be better because they found what they needed and they can get back to work.
Yeah, exactly. And you can still have, even if it's not approved, a word like switch, you can still use it as a synonym online.
Yeah.
So that people, whenever they look for the wrong term, it will still lead them to the right content. And it's the same. And we now talk about the word switch, but we had a medical customer that have like the table that a patient lays on.
Yeah.
They had like 20 different terms to call, like it was the patient table, or the word couch. So if people try to look for the word couch, but you're calling it patient table, and there's not a link between those two, you're going to end up frustrating your customer because they will not be able to find it, right? So, and again, this is not just where the right content, but this is also where structure comes in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because if the content that you have has got these good ties between synonyms, and it has that structure back there behind the scenes that's machine readable, then you could search for the term couch on that site and you could still get return results for operating table or whatever else, whatever other terms, what other synonyms might be included. And the reason is because if it's structured content, we can index those searches according to that content that's there. So if there are synonyms involved, the searches can be indexed to include those synonyms. So if you search for a synonym, you'll get the result for the other item, the other term that's actually in the text itself.
Yeah, very good. Yes.
And we can go into more detail about that in a little bit if we would like.
Yeah, well, actually, the next slide talks a little bit about
perfect.
It introduces the products that both Heretto and Anaplan, in the case of HyperSTE, for instance, do offer. And it's not just about the products itself, right? So when you, I mean, just very briefly, and then you can introduce Heretto.
Yeah, sure.
But when you do a content quality implementation, although the implementation is pretty straightforward, it's always really important to realize that if you really want to create content that is clear and concise, and that is being used consistently throughout your global team of writers, that it's always going to be necessary to standardize on your own corporate terminology. Right. So if we, and that's something that we do offer as a service, just like the training I mentioned, it's also a really important part. It's a matter of fact, if you want to do this successfully, then doing those three things, using HyperSTE, 1, 2, making sure that the terminology that it's checking against is including your corporate terms that you're using. Make sure that words like I mentioned with the medical device customer, words like bench, table, couch, patient table are all in that dictionary. And then of course one needs to be approved, and the others, when writers write the unapproved form, it will lead them to the approved one. And then training as well. Training is really important because again, it not just looks at the writing rules, but it also results in writers sticking with the need to know versus the nice to know, and as a direct result of the training, people can reduce 40% in content. So just from an implementation perspective, what's involved there?
Yeah, that's right. And I think one, just to kind of bring this up, one thing that I've heard from prospects in the past is that, well, if we incorporate all these things, I mean, these are really nice business buy-ins, but writers are going to be frustrated because they don't have any freedom now because we're enforcing all these rules and there are all these systems in the background checking. But that's not been my experience as a writer in here. I actually have a lot of freedom to structure things, to make language choices the way I do, while terms can be enforced, particular terms for particular business purposes. It doesn't limit my ability to structure the content, the way I write a sentence, the types of phrasing I use. I still get that kind of writer's freedom in there, and that's really important. Another thing that I think is really important, and we'll see this when we get to the demo. So the screenshot that we're looking at here is a screenshot of the Heretto system with HyperSTE running at the same time. One thing that doesn't show up in here is there may be, you may have terms that are, if you're in a structured content environment, are being reused from another file. And without going into all the technical detail about reuse, that term itself might be something that's highly, highly controlled in the structure of the content. But there are a lot of terms. In fact, most terms you would never want to do that with. So things like product names, company names, those types of things are real good target candidates for reused content, which would be highly controlled from within the structured content itself. But you can see here, the term acceptable, you would never want to do that with a term like that. It would be onerous for writers to keep up with that. And it would be way more content management overhead than it's worth. What you need is a system exactly like HyperSTE that's doing this kind of checking against a rule, so that writers can simply type in the text they need, and then the rules can run against that. Again, we can go into, we'll see an actual example of this combination later of a term that's being used structurally, that's being reused structurally from another file, and then these types of terms around it where HyperSTE is checking for them.
Yeah.
But some important things here, the structured content, whether it's in Heretto or anywhere else, is actually, it's the methodology of having structured XML content behind the scenes. So what we're seeing here on the screen looks like a typical, a pretty common text editor, but behind the scenes, it's structured XML content. And then HyperSTE is actually functions in this case as a browser extension that runs over the top of this. So in a sense, it's directly embedded in the Heretto system. And so it runs over the content and checks all this content for compliance, which is really cool.
Yeah, very good. You actually, Jared, you want to go ahead and share your screen so that we
Sure.
can actually see this thing in action?
Sure. Let's see. Gotta move this out of the way real quick. Sorry. We've all been doing Zoom meetings for 3 years. You'd think we'd have this down already. There we go. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, good. So what we've got here, this is an example. So this is the Heretto system. What we're looking at is sample content. So this is actually, this content is called the Thunderbird guide. This is some XML content that people put together just as a way to highlight what structured content can look like in a system. So it's very, this is very generic content. It's not for an actual product. But the thing I want to point out here, I don't have HyperSTE running right now, and that's intentional. You can see if I put my cursor here, I get a check mark over here, and this says check text. If I do that, that will initiate HyperSTE to actually check all of the content here on this page to see if it's adhering to particular rules. But what I want to point out right now is this orange outline that we have here. So this is what we call a schematron rule. And so there's a little bit of difference between how HyperSTE is functioning and what it's doing versus what schematron is. And if you're not aware of schematron, just very roughly and basically, schematron is a validation language that checks for either the presence or absence of particular XML combinations or patterns in the XML. It's defined rules. So these can be organization specific that your teams can define, and these could adhere to different principles. So the thing that schematron is really, really, really good at is checking for actual XML structural differences. So it looks for a pattern. So in this case, we get what I'm going to call a rule violation here. And our system represents this with this orange line around it and a little tick mark here. And if I hover over that, it says, this is rule structure number 19. This is something that we as an organization, as Heretto, have defined and say, anytime we insert this note element into the XML, so this note here, it needs to have a type attribute assigned to it. And what that means is when we turn this XML content into HTML or PDF or something else, we have engines that will do the conversion. So it will take that XML content and convert it into the different output format. Those engines are looking for the presence of the note element with a particular attribute so that we can style it correctly. And so what this is doing is we have a rule that says to our writers, hey, anytime there's a note, make sure it has a type attribute set. And what I can do is I can come over here and I can come down to type and I can apply one. Let's say this is a remember. As soon as I apply that, then you can see the tick mark has gone away and this orange box will go away as well. Now, one other thing, we have other rules built in as well. So this short description here, this is right now a placeholder. There's no text here. If I actually remove that, then we get another violation. You can see the orange box pops up around the whole thing and we can hover over that and you can see each topic should contain a short description element. Now this is one level and then we have some others built in. So if I undo that, that violation goes away. I'm actually going to change this type to, let's do it to warning. Let's make it a little more serious. Now, if we come down here and we have a couple of the rules written just by way of example, if I come down here and then I'm going to insert an unordered list, so just a bullet, I automatically get a violation. Why? Well, because we think that it's best that an unordered list or an ordered list should contain 2 or more items, never just one by itself. And so we have this rule here that will fire immediately as soon as we insert that violation. And then we have these quick fixes as well. So the Schematron rules can be written to include what are called quick fixes. And we will give a button for that quick fix, and it will just add another item there. And then when we place our cursor in here, you can see that violation is gone, and the tick mark is gone there. Now, Schematron becomes really powerful when it's checking for those types of structure changes, those XML structures. HyperSTE becomes exceptional when we stack these together. So the combination of Schematron plus HyperSTE becomes really powerful. Then if we come down here, let's say we scroll down, we've been working. Actually, Barry, we talked about using this. So let's go back up here. If I click this check now, then HyperSTE runs over that content, and now we get these violations here, or these things that need to be addressed. And these can be defined by, actually, Barry, I should let you fill in details about HyperSTE. Sorry. Oh, you're muted. Barry, I think you're muted. Uh-oh.
Yeah, it seems odd. I'm trying to actually unmute.
Sorry, I think I actually might have lost internet connection there for a minute.
Okay, no, I'm good. I was
okay. Yeah.
for whatever reason. No, could you jump to the guides on top of your screen?
Yeah.
I think that was the other one, right? That you wanted to share.
Yeah, so that was another point I want to make. So let me refresh this here, and then because I think I got booted offline for just a second. Thank you. That was one thing I wanted to point out. So here's something I think that's really important about the STE, the HyperSTE integration with Heretto. So if we run this here, what I have over here in this other tab is actually a new version of our system that is not even released yet. But the nice thing is that if I click here, this is our coffee brewing guide that I wrote up. You can see here that this note violation is firing here. Here's another Schematron violation. But I can click here, and because HyperSTE is an extension in the browser, it will run over the top of this independently of which version we run, which is really nice. So there's not a dependency there of, any update to HyperSTE that needs to happen when our software updates and vice versa. So it runs straight across both.
Yeah, and so when you click on where over there,
yep.
So it highlights it blue, and blue stands for not approved, and I'll talk more about that, what different colors means. That you see, you need to write things out in full. So then where then becomes we are, and click on using, for instance. So using is a gerund form, and using can be regarded as it's not clear who is doing what to whom, right? Even though it says you'll learn to hand brew coffee using, it's like, no, it needs to be you use, or in this case, I think there was another example there. Oh yeah, we recommend you use in the section below there.
Oh, right. Right.
You update that portion, and we recommend you use the Heretto V60. So so gerunds are not really liked because it's not clear who is doing what to whom, right? Do I need to do it? Is somebody else doing it? Is it happening automatically? And so these are things that you can see are already getting picked up here.
Yeah, and that's one place where the localization savings are going to come in, because this is really, I think this is all really cool, because HyperSTE runs over this. It makes a suggestion, and here we click a term, and let's see, we could change this to give or gives. Serious is another one, so important or dangerous. In this case, these may not fit, but that's because we haven't defined how serious should be used here, and we could do that. But right. The really important point is that HyperSTE, when I make that change and click this change here for HyperSTE to actually have some effect here, it's updating the structured content. The structured content under the hood and behind the scenes that we're creating. And so the combination of a schematron rule that keeps the XML structure, it has this XML structure and will enforce an XML structure that adheres to this voice that you want to have as an organization. Layer on top of that HyperSTE that will actually allow you to, it will check the XML content and then will allow you to update the XML content directly. In turn means you send off cleaner content for translation, clearer content, so that when your translator sees, instead of you'll hear a conjunction, we could change this to you will, and then we're off to the races, and the translator can spend less time and be more effective in doing the translation work that you actually get back and then upload back into the system.
Yeah, you can already see here, there's a lot of colors, of course, but those colors are there because there's not been a dictionary defined yet for this coffee, Heretto blend coffee brewing company, for instance. So words like brew coffee need to be defined in the dictionary, in this case as approved noun, but you can add that as a candidate, for instance. If you stand on coffee, it's going to ask you, do you want to add that as a candidate to the term dictionary, and then a terminology manager, the person that has that role can then approve or not approve it. But I'll show that to you actually in a moment. Should we go ahead and jump to my screen?
Yeah, sure.
I'll just go ahead and share my screen again, which is right here. And here we are. So now, of course, I'll sign in again. Oh, it's going to ask me to do the same thing here. Just need to reload this. And I'll jump over to, it was Thunderbird, wasn't it? Here you go.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, so in here, I'll do the same thing. So you can see HyperST sitting on top of, in this case, the Chrome browser. If I do a check here, it checks the text according to the writing rules that you have enabled. I'll dive into how you can configure that in a moment. If you want to see reports, that's something you can do as well. So it found 84 errors. You can click on that again, and then it will open up an additional field that shows the report. So in this case, for this particular page, there's readability, flash kink upgrade, translatability, all of those things. Some error classes, and then you go to the, of course, your score, your compliance rating right there, and then you can go to the detailed results and see which words need to be added to the dictionary or which words are not approved, so that specifically if you start a project like this, it'll help you get some ideas on what the big problem areas are. So you basically gives you an overview of the low-hanging fruit that you can solve first, for instance. So
yeah, this is cool.
Yeah, so, but anyway, if we go back to this and then, so I'm just going to just look at this first sentence here. So this content was developed, right? So, okay, that needs to then be created. to demonstrate. And once you start editing, the colors disappear, so it gives you the time to do that, but you can recheck it. So we go to show, could needs to be can, and so you can just basically go through it, do some word for words replacements. So instead of to meet their complex requirements, it would be for their complex, and then not complex and varied needs, but for their specific needs. I'm just going through.
Oh, that's cool.
You already see, just by making a couple of replacements, I'm actually reducing the content. And you're good to go. The other cool thing is that there's a sentence database, so I can look up not just the word, but I can look up if there is a sentence in here that we may want to reuse, and then it will then show up. And this is where, again, where structure and Heretto and Schematron and HyperSTE all really come together. So you are not able to just do word for word replacements. You could do that on a full sentence level. And again, if you have different writers writing different thoughts, using or writing the same thought, but using different words, because there's a lot of different words that you could use to write the same thing, right? So if I say turn off the power, well, you can also say switch off the power, or make sure the power is in the off position, or de-energize the machine. You know, your translation vendor is going to look at that and say, well, there's a lot of non-perfect matches there, and you're going to get charged for that. But if you have that content controlled, and you're going to have people reuse their sentences as well, then that could reduce your content by even more. So, and just to kind of, as Jared showed you a little bit about the background about Schematron here, if I do the same with HyperSTE, so the cloud version that we launched about 2 years ago. So within here, you have the ability to define your users. So if you buy a number of licenses, then let's say it's 5, then you can have an unlimited number of users that you can give different roles of a technical writer or a terminology manager. The difference, for instance, would be that the terminology manager is able to approve new terms, because if you're going to allow all your technical writers to do that, well, you're going to get a lot of approved words, of course. We don't want to do that. But it allows to use it. You know, there's other applications that it supports as well. But yeah, user management is done in here. You can manage your terms. You can manage whichever rules you would like to use. So if there's a style guide that you have in place, you can mirror that against HyperSTE and allow for certain rules to be turned on or off. So terminology, spelling, grammar, length, style, and structure. And if we go down here, there's some Microsoft manual of style rules in here as well. It even does, and again, this is where structure again comes in, allows for conditional checking, so that HyperST can actually look at the elements, the tags that you're using inside Heretto, and then allow for conditional checking. So whenever it sees a certain element, tag, then it can say, okay, well, I now see this action I draft or ref tag here. I need to check that according to descriptive rules, or I need to check that according to procedural rules, or only checking for terminology, or skipping it all together because the tag includes copyright or legal information, for instance. So this is kind of the backbone of everything, where you define your users, you define your terms, you define your writing rules, and then you go, in the end, you go to your move this over here, your settings, and then you define which dictionary you would like to work, or with dictionaries you would like to work with this day. So it would be the Heretto dictionary, or you can even have a dictionary that sits on top of that. The idea is that if you are working with different customers or different projects or different divisions, they each can have their own terminology list, and the project dictionary will override the secondary dictionary, which will override the primary dictionary. So we give you a little bit more flexibility.
That's cool. So you could have product dictionaries even. How many is there a limit on the number of like project dictionaries that you could have?
No, there's a zero limit. The only limit is that you can work with up to 3 dictionaries at the same time.
Okay.
But it could be that, for instance, And you don't have to do this with unique words, because if they're unique, well, then there's not a problem. But if you are using words that for this customer, it could mean A, and for another customer, it could mean B, then you may want to have an additional dictionary in place, because it could be that you have to meet certain term requirements for that particular customer, while the overall corporate dictionary still would approve or not approve a certain word. In other words, you have the ability to be flexible there, depending on the audience that you're talking to.
Yeah, I think this is one of the major strengths here, is being able to have multiple dictionaries running that are checking for terminology, and the fact that they're hierarchical like that too, so you're not going to get conflicts. That's, I think, specifically looking for terminology is, that's not what Schematron was ever designed for. And so having this combination where you get XML, not validation, but XML checking for organization specific structures, plus all this terminology and grammatical checking, it's really kind of a very, very powerful combination of tools to get consistent content, good content.
All very complementary. So it's again, if you look at standards, DITA, Schematron, Simplified English, and you see how they all complement each other is really a nice thing to see. And that's in essence what we're trying to say here today as well. Of course, there's product promotion as well, but there, standards that are there to use, and how they actually effectively help each other out. So
that's right.
Okay, so maybe a little bit about this one.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned before, Schematron rules are it's a validation language that's meant to check for the presence or absence of particular XML structures. That's its design. Its explicit design purpose. It's open standard. The rules are written in typically in XPath 2, so this open standard language as well. So this isn't anything that's unique to us. It's something that an organization can create a set of rules on their own, or work with us or a partner organization to define those rules, and then we can actually write them. If you guys have team members that can write them, you give us the actual file with all the rules defined, we upload it into the system, and they start checking immediately. The interesting thing I think about Schematron is that it's not a rule violation like what we see here on the screen. A rule violation doesn't mean the content won't publish or can't be sent out for translation or anything like that. You can think of this as a slap on the XML wrist for your writers. Is really what this amounts to. Is it's a reminder to them, hey, we have this rule for our organization, and your content as it stands is violating one of those rules. So fix that up, and we can help you with that. So it's really a way to remind the writers that there's a particular structure in place for the organization's needs. Like I said, it can be developed in-house if you have team members who know XPath and they can write the rules. You can write them and send them over, and we can upload them. And then it just kind of continually runs in the background. So anytime you open up a file and you start working on it in Heretto, Schematron rules are running in the background all the time. And then actually HyperSTE can be configured to run all the time too.
Yeah. And so, even though it says here Heretto plus HyperSTE, it's Schematron, it's DITA, simplified authoring, it's all of these different standards that are out there combined, where critical content can be much easily created, where you do get your business drivers going there. Having your ROI up to 40% improvement in review process, we have seen 60% reduction in overall content development process. Now, in the beginning with STE, with Simplified English, you will see actually the content for existing content. So going from existing content to something that is easier to understand, having that content quality stamp on it, you're going to see the effort go up a little bit because you're being forced to create clarity. But for new content, you'll definitely see it go down, and in the long run, it will definitely go down. So if you have, let's say, a page or a manual that's 100 pages, In the beginning, you'll see the level go up, or the effort level go up. However, instead of 100 pages, you now only have to write 60 pages, because you're sticking with that need to know aspect that I mentioned already. So.
Yep.
And then 30% savings in translation and localization, where we've even seen examples of 40%, and then again, reduced word count also by 40%. So there's some great metrics there. And I think that if you have nothing also to add there, Jared, that kind of concludes it. So we can open up the, because I think looking at the time, it's 5:02.
Yep.
We can have some questions.
So there was one question that actually just came in. I gave it a short answer, but I think it'd be, you could elaborate on this. So the question was, does HyperSTE work if you're not using DITA? And the answer is yes. And then I was going to let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course, it is still better if you have structure in place. But yeah, HyperSTE does not look at structure. That's what Schematron does. That's what Heretto does. HyperSTE only looks at the content. At the end of the day, your end user opens up your content on a browser or on their iPad or using augmented reality. So that content is able to go to different media formats because of XML, because of DITA. But at the end of the day, your end user doesn't care about DITA. It doesn't care about any of those things. It just wants to get to the information that they need to, for installation or for support purposes. And that information needs to be easy to find and easy to read and easy to understand, so that they can get their needs over with rather quickly. And that's really what we're doing. And that's why the combination is so golden. So yes, of course, content can be written in Microsoft Word or a Notepad, and you can use HyperSTE on that. But of course, if you really want to do it the right way, then data structure and everything else should also be in place.
Sure. So we have more questions in the queue, by the way. I think looks like most of these are going to be for you. Let's see. So I think the first one that came in was, do you have a list of dictionaries HyperSTE integrates with? We use Stedman's medical dictionary.
There is a few dictionaries. There's not too many. So there's the generic STE dictionary that has about 3,000 words. There are some other dictionaries in place, but those dictionaries are usually lists with words, and all of those words are usually allowed, or at least there is no definition on whether they should be approved or not approved. And so we have looked, of course, over the last 20 years, we always look at other dictionaries. We take those into consideration as well. We use the Microsoft dictionary, for instance, but that doesn't mean that the work is done there, because you still need to define if you're looking at am I looking at a screen right now, or is it a display, or is it a display monitor? So those are the types of choices that you still need to make as an organization, as a group of writers, on which words you're going to approve and which not. So even though some of those dictionaries can be incorporated, those decisions will still need to be made.
We've got another one. How does this work with a CMS? The question is, we use Windchill and ArborText. Do you guys have a way to integrate with Windchill and ArborText?
Yeah, we do.
Cool.
We support ArborText, FrameMaker, Oxygen. If you go to simplifiedenglish.net and then under HyperSTE, there should be an overview of integrations. Heretto, of course, is a really important one, but we integrate with other authoring tools as well. And how it works as far as checking it in, well, Heretto, you can talk about that, Jared, because it's all online. But if you look at Windchill, for instance, you need to check in or check out your content, apply structure, apply content rules, and you check it back into in this case Windchill. But there's other content management systems out there as well.
Yeah. So just briefly about ours. So Heretto doesn't have a check-in, check-out process because we are cloud-based, and we're also we have real-time collaboration in the XML environment itself. So if you noticed during the demo portion, When Barry was showing his screen, there was an orange cursor below him. That was actually me. I had the same file open and running in my browser, and I can make edits and updates there. So there isn't a checkout process, and HyperSTE and Schematron still run in both of our browsers because it's actually it's running over the content. So HyperSTE is going to check in either case, and then Schematron is always running behind the scenes as well. There's a question about reuse, and I'm going to answer what I think. So there's the reuse example. The question is, the reuse example you showed is HyperSTE pulling reuse options from the topics in your library or a separate HyperSTE repository. When I showed, there were cases, let's see, Barry, do you mind if I share my screen?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. I'm just going to pull up one of these really quickly and show this. Okay, so in this case, when I mentioned reuse, so here's our company name. That's maybe make this slightly larger. So this is our company name here. This is a bit of reuse. This is a very specific data mechanism behind the scenes. So when I click on this, I get this ID here, which is vars proper noun / company name. So when HyperSTE runs over something like this, it's actually pulling the text here, Heretto, and it's saying unknown word. We can add that as a candidate, but the XML content behind the scenes is actually that bit of text that says Heretto doesn't exist in this file. I'm actually pulling that text from another file. And while this gets into like the weeds, the benefit of doing it that way for this type of text is this is a company name. Like I mentioned earlier, a company name or a product name would be good candidates for these. I control that bit of text in a single file. So all throughout my documentation, our documentation, if any of our writers use the term Heretto, they know they need to use this reusable term. And that way, let's say we rebrand, which we did actually. We did this just a few months ago, which is why on our final slide with our email addresses, I need to actually append mine because I have a different email address now. But we went through a rebrand. And so when I had to update all of our documentation to say Heretto instead of Jorsic, I went to a single file and I changed one term and then it updated in thousands of places. You don't want to do that with terms like serious, about, coffee, data, but for company names and product names, that becomes valuable. Now that's stored in the XML and that's something we would use there. Barry, I'll get your advice on, what would be the path here for this term like Heretto, where HyperSTE says it's an unknown candidate. Is that something that you would want to add?
Yeah, you simply add it as an approved technical noun, and
okay,
you're good to go. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
This is, of course, is where you go into the cloud portal again as the person who would have the terminology manager role, and he or she would then be able to approve that term or not approve it, which of course in this case it needs to be approved.
Sure.
But then, they would have, for instance, the word easy data as a product name not approved. And then whenever people are using that, it will be telling them, no, Jorsec or easy data now is Heretto. So you will be doing your branding a lot easier there as well. Yeah.
That's cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And then as far as the reuse of the sentences are concerned, so maybe very briefly, we use the approach of a translation memory. So, and what a translation memory does is when translators translate content, they are translated from English to German, it's being verified against the translation memory, and the translation memory will tell the translator, hey, you have a translation that was done by yourself or by a colleague of yours that's in the repository. Do you want to reuse the whole translation or maybe part of the translation? Facilitate reuse. So this is the same principle. The idea is that we again do not touch the structure, but we say this sentence was already rewritten by another writer or maybe by yourself in the past. Do you want to maybe reuse that whole sentence or part of that sentence in order to facilitate that people write the source in the same way? So if you say, Again, turn off engines is not required, or make
Right.
sure your engines are in the off position, or ensure engines are not on, then that everybody will reuse that one sentence that is approved, and instead of using all of those other different variables. And that is then going to go as a perfect, not just a perfect word, not just a perfect match, but a perfect sentence will go to your translation memory to your vendors, and then you get a much lower invoice for them.
Yeah, yeah.
Plus the fact that you tackled the ambiguity process, because if you
Yep.
have turn off engines not required, well, actually that can be interpreted two different ways. Turn off those engines that are not required, or turn off engines is not required at all.
Yeah.
As a translator, you are not able to catch that because you're not a subject matter expert.
Right.
You're going to assume that it has meaning one or two. And now you don't only have a problem in the English source, but also in your translation. So it's not just about saving cost, it's also about preventing a lot of the ambiguity issues, because something like that is never going to be caught otherwise.
Yeah, and having the means to catch those kinds of grammatical issues like this is very, very important. I wish I could have this running over my dissertation work too.
And so I think there was a last question that if we support Flare. Yes, we also support Flare. But again, go to simplifyingenglish.net and then you'll see a list of integrations there.
Barry, I did want to ask a question about the setting up your dictionaries. I'm sure it's very dependent on how large your content is, but can you give a sense of how much time it takes for a smaller project or versus someone like a VMware that has, huge amounts of content?
Well, yeah, it kind of depends on indeed the size of the project. If it's for your entire organization, then if we do it, because we have linguists in-house that are objective, and I'll tell you why the word objective is so important. Then it will take about a month for us to do it. Then you'll have a repository of thousands of terms, whether they're approved or not approved. If companies end up wanting to do this themselves, there are ways by creating a report, and then you can look at the words that are being listed as either unknown or not approved, put them in a high to low frequency order, and reports like that that you can run on all of your content will allow you to already or start with words that occur the most, and that can give you a bit of a good head start. But because within and this is based again on 20 years of experience, you don't have to use our services, but again, based on 20 years of experience, we see that there's a lot of content owners, if you will. And so rather than people taking a decision on which word needs to be approved because of linguistic aspects, they would say it because they are basically, believe me or not, emotionally attached to terms. We have to call it this because we've always called it that way, or because I invented that term and I wanted to come back in the marketing aspect, or and then we have sales and marketing involved, and they say, well, engineer, you can call it that word, but that word doesn't sell, and so it needs to be. The engineer will say, well, I don't agree with you, and so you have a lot of, in the review process, you have a lot of discussions, and so those couple of weeks that we would take can take a company sometimes months, if not years. And so be aware of that.
Right.
Standardizing on terms is not necessarily, even if it's called simplifying English, this part is not something that is simple.
Right.
Yeah. And that likewise with the move to structured content, it's a really powerful tool. It's very it has a lot of cost savings down the road, but there's upfront work to be done. Yeah,
you need to create awareness. And that same goes for structure as well as the content itself. People that are involved within the organization in the review process, or maybe there's engineers or subject matter experts that are somehow involved with content. Well, they need to at least be aware of that you're doing this, because otherwise they're going to be reviewing something and they're like, well, that's not what I was trying to say. or what is this? And again, you're going to go back into those discussions. So when you do an implementation like this, then of course it's not just as easy as just doing it. No, the people need to be involved, they need to be aware, and there's a process.
Yep.
All right, are there any more questions for the panelists? Normally when I say that, few people type in a 1 or 2 last minute questions. But if not, I want to thank you both for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in person in 2022. And everybody
Likewise.
How
happy
nice was it?
holidays. And
Happy
New
holidays.
Year.
Happy
Yes.
holidays. It'll be good to see you guys in person again.
Be great.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.